This Week in Economics on the 25th of August 2018 from A Numbers Man. We are here and part of WBRN Radio and the Bostonred Network as we merge things together. This is the Numbers Man part, our macroeconomics report, and we do this weekly. This week we'll be spotlighting Jackson Hole. That's the annual conclave sponsored by the Kansas City Fed in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Grand Teton Park. We'll dive a little deeper into some of the principal papers delivered there, but we'll first start out with an overview here from the Bloomberg people on August the 25th. The Fed keeps its cool at Jackson Hole despite pressure from Trump. The Fed historically has been an independent institution. The presidential effect is usually the person that the president appointed to head the Fed. And in essence, DJ Trump has appointed the current head of the Fed, and that particular current head of the Fed has followed the policy basically of Jerome Powell of Chair Yellen. When she was here, Chair Yellen, of course, was an academic-trained economist, but one had been at the San Francisco Fed and had been around a very, very long time. Whereas Mr. Powell is from the business community. He's not an economist, but he is a titular head, as they would say. The job of the central bank and my job is to make decisions on monetary policy without regard to political consequences or influences. That's from the Dallas Fed. The president there is Robert Kaplan. I'm very confident we can do that. And this is some pushback against DJ Trump. I guess Trump doesn't understand what's going on. He talked to a group of Republicans early in the month, said he was disappointed with his appointee. Well, DJ Trump just doesn't quite understand what's going on. Pressed on whether Trump's comments don't at least complicate their job, Kaplan and his colleagues mostly shrugged it off and repeated the line that the Fed Open Market Committee will simply carry on with its job. And from Esta, George, she's president of the Kansas City Fed. The committee is focused on the mandate given to us by Congress and try to make decisions that are in the long-term interest of growing an economy. That is where the Fed is in terms of the economy on a long-term basis, not on a short-term basis. The DJ Trump economic program, if we look at it, has components of the Reagan economic program. In other words, there's some things there, less government regulations, in other words, opening up the throttles, tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, individual tax cuts. That is the old trickle-down theory. You put more money into the economy. But there was already more money in the economy. And see, that's a problem within itself. The tax cuts under Reagan were very small compared to DJ Trump's corporate tax cut and also the individual tax cuts, but they are pretty minuscule. We talked about this on our political show, Numbers Man, a little bit, not very much, but what's happened here is the taxpayers have become accustomed to, we'll say, $100 extra in their paychecks. We don't do that anymore because people basically don't get paychecks. What they get is their earnings, and that is directly deposited to whomever. I read it on that point. I read a very interesting article on something called open banking, which is coming more and more to a bank or financial firm near you. What that basically means is that banks will become very different. You'll have various pay terminals, destinations, I guess we'll call them, sort of like the PayPal that one can deposit funds in. Now, a PayPal account's hooked to a bank account but some of the others are not necessarily hooked to a bank account at all. You can deposit your funds directly with them, and then you can dispense your funds as you see. And in the EU, it's coming more to reality because the regulations there are much, much stricter. But banks are trying it also. It revolves around the idea of you have a bank, for instance, Citibank or whomever, it doesn't matter, Bank of America, and they are bringing other partners into their tent. So you would, for instance, be bombarded with literature from Equifax, and Equifax is doing the same thing. They would recommend financial institutions, and then you'd have other people coming in all at the same time that have various financial products to sell to you. So these things, a lot of it, we'll get into these papers, a lot of things the Fed used to do and traditional models used to focus on are not there. We have one paper, the Amazon effect. Incidentally, we will append these papers to the forecast, to the show notes. But what we're going to attempt to do here is just highlight them. Obviously, we cannot read the whole papers, and admission up front here, we have not read the papers in full. We will read these papers in full, and we'll regurgitate it back to at a later date. Back to the Bloomberg report here. On the sideline, a number of conference attendees and said the Fed has been very little choice but to demonstrate a thick skin to ignore DJ Trump. A suggestion that Fed officials should respond by raising rates more aggressively to prove of their independence was roundly rejected, and was the idea that Powell should warn the president publicly against further comments. I think he should avoid any tit-for-tat exchange with the president. That is from Alan Bender. Alan Bender used to be a vice chair of the Fed. Powell, he added, should respond mostly by action to show. In other words, action speaks louder than words. The Fed chair made no public response. He said in an interview on the 12th of July with the American Public Media Marketplace Program that the Fed does its work in a strictly non-political way based upon detailed analysis that does not take political considerations in effect there. Another Fed Vice Chair, Don Cole, said he was confident the committee would not be distracted from following its legislative mandate, but added that Powell could help shield the Fed from pressure by better communications to the public on the rationale for policy decisions. One of the things we are doing here in this broadcast, our attendees know the irony that DJ Trump is complaining about high rates, since Powell is widely seen by economists as having taken a very cautious approach. The U.S. economy growth accelerated, and unemployment now at 3.9. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm sure the Fed's not going to depart from its very responsible strategy. That's Jacob Finkel, chair of J.C. Morgan Chase International. Jackson Hole on Friday, Powell suggested increases will remain appropriate, but he made clear that inflation is still low, and he's not worried about the economy overheating, and would not seek an aggressive policy unless inflation jumps. And one of the problems in a modern capitalist economy is that it can jump very, very quickly. The negotiation with Mexico, while we're here with Bloomberg, is moving along. One of the sticking points has been energy, and they expect to sort that out. We just leave it as such. We'll do a little introductory here. The Amazon effect makes a central bank job hard. Inflation has been lowered by standard economic models than would predict throughout the current expansion. Some blame Amazon for keeping prices low, but there's another so-called Amazon effect that might be more relevant to for central bankers, according to a paper, and that's Alberto Cavallo at the Fed Bank there. Cavallo's main findings was that competition from Amazon has led to greater frequency of price changes at more traditional retailers like Walmart, and also more unfamiliarity in pricing the same item across different locations. On uniformity, I'm sorry about that. It is as familiarity. In other words, we'll get to pricing models in a minute here. He found that the shifts have led to a greater influence of movements in the dollar exchange rate and gas prices on retail prices. For monetary policy and those interested in inflation dynamics, the implication is that retail prices are becoming less insulated from those common nationwide shocks. That is what Cavallo wrote. Fuel prices, exchange rates, fluctuations, and other forms affecting costs that may enter the pricing algorithms used by these firms are most likely to have a faster and larger impact on retail prices than in the past. The dynamics may complicate matters for the Fed as they navigate the signals from unemployment. Unemployment traditionally, but the measure of unemployment now is less than it has been in the past. So we can go back to when we looked at unemployment as 2.5% at the time. This was in the 60s, and that was full employment. Let me get that straight there. But now full employment under G.W. Bush was at about 4.5%. That was full employment. So thus the employment number, and it's all, I remember at Jobs with Peace, we talked about that, and the peace dividend and those sorts of things, and we looked at the unemployment rate. We did not have the big data at the time. However, when we looked at the official unemployment rate, we were talking about 26 weeks. It was still 26 weeks. And you start to, the workers start to disappear from the system. And then we have the long-term unemployed, etc. Those are marginally attached, new words there, but basically what it all boils down to is people that are officially counted as unemployed tend to disappear from the statistical circumference after a year or so, and then 1 year or 2 years, and we have these people. But we also at the same time have a gig economy. We have more temporary or part-time jobs, very, very hard to do the counting. So actually the unemployment figure, we spotlighted a town in Iowa, Ames, Iowa. That's the headquarters of the Iowa State University and an animal laboratory. Unemployment very low in 1.5, somewhere there. But people that were unemployed there, the 1% or 1.5%, were still having difficulty finding jobs. And those that were working, there were plenty of low-wage jobs around. But rents and etc. were increasing. So thus workers could not support themselves on one job, period. So those are things that come out we have to look at, and higher rents, etc., do contribute to inflation. Now, inflation in terms of the number is weaker than it's been before. Domestic demand conditions could lead policymakers astray. Powell cited a Fed working a paper there. So it's a situation where the Fed is attempting to prepare for the future. Now, in future, let me just finish with, go back to Mr. Cordova's study here showed that from 2008 to 2017, online purchases accounted for an ever-growing share of total retail sales. The average duration of price of goods sold at U.S. retailers like Walmart fell from 6.5 months to 3.7, and some actually less. The impact has subtle effects on monetary policy because so-called sticky prices, the notion that sellers aren't able to change prices right away in response to changes in supply and demand. That is not true. It's precisely what gives interest rates power in mainstream models to have an effect on the economy at all. In these models, the price adjustments simultaneously with response to shocks, and then there is no role for the Fed Bank to guide the supply and demand back into equilibrium. For monetary models, empirical work, my results suggest that the focus needs to move beyond traditional normal rigors. That is what Cavallo wrote, labor costs, limited information, and even decision costs related to intentional and limited capacity to process data will tend to disappear as more resellers use algorithms to do the pricing. So that's basically what's happening. It used to be that the individual would decide the price of whatever util they were talking about, so that would change things. From Reuters, the gradual effect is still here. The Fed began to move its monetary policy in 2015. Inflation is strong. Inflation is near our 2% objective. It's actually over that. So basically about the same thing. The benchmark 500 index, the NASDAQ composite hit all-time highs after Powell's speech, while the dollar weakened against a basket of currencies. And, of course, the traders on interest rates bet on September and December as the Fed raising probably 0.25 there, 25 basis points, as they call it, from Netter Shura, an economist at the MIT Sloan School of Management. The Fed should remain above the fray. Well, you have to understand, in a political environment, you can't remain above the fray. Euro futures, including financial markets, expect one hike next year, leaving the rate in the range of 2.50 to 2.7% by mid-2019, up from the Fed's current target of 2%. So, in other words, we're looking at rate hikes at 25 basis points there. And the problem with these models is that the models, what the models do with prices, and I've observed over at Amazon, just anecdotal, but the prices are not as cheap as they used to be. Trade talks, here, nothing going on. The Fed, he said the Fed's mistakes of the past, such as estimates of full employment that allowed inflation to tick off in the 80s. Well, in the 80s we didn't have big data. Made the central bank today, means the central bank today should not assume that its current estimate of these economic variables are precise. Well, actually not. That is what the problem is. We were thinking of Arpa Occam there, a very good economist, with President Johnson. With unemployment so low, why is the Fed tightening a monetary policy more sharply to head off overheating and inflation with no clear sign of inflation any problem? So these are some questions here that they're asking, and the resolution, he said, is to move carefully. And let me just move on here. The Amazon effect here. This is from Reuters. We talked about it There, in the past 10 years, online competition has raised both the frequency of price changes and the degree of uniform pricing across locations. This is Mr. Cadover. He's an associate professor at the Harvard Business School who analyzed so-called multi-channel retailers, those with brick and mortar and online, such as Walmart and Amazon. Well, Amazon is online, but Amazon's not the only ball game in town. We have many, and Amazon. You also have to look at Amazon in terms of retailers that are there, that are not Amazon, but they're in the Amazon space, sort of like. I had to get a shot of coffee here. The eBay people. So these things out there, and they can change overnight, but. I have to go more into a competition model here, and let me just. This is reflecting on dwindling workers' bargaining power and monetary policies. Alan Kruger, he's at the Princeton University, and thank you, Dr. George. I commented at the Kansas City Federal Reserve. I commend, for exploring the topic of changing market structures and monetary policy. Many of the product market developments discussed this year's symposium have important implications for wages, employment, and wage setting. I'm focused my remarks on changes in the labor market competition and workers' bargaining power. We'll scan through this paper very, very quickly here. Although economists' go-to models of labor market is often one with perfect competition where bargaining power is irrelevant because supply and demand determines the wages, therefore is nothing firms can do about it. In many applications, I think this is more appropriate to model the labor market as an imperfect competition subject to monopolies like effects, collusive behavior by firms, search fractions and surpluses that are bargained over. As a result, these labor market features firms should be viewed as wage setters and wage negotiators rather than as wage takers. This perspective can explain why well-documented phenomena in the labor market, such as high vulnerability in pay for workers with identical skills, variability, in different industries and firms, lack the evidence that minimum wage increases reduces employment, and the reluctance of firms to raise wages when vacancies are hard to fill. Now that is a very important part. That's why we went into these papers, and you're seeing that out there. Some of these firms are not filling positions, especially in the lower echelons. I've noticed that many economists are skeptical of the notion that markets are manageable, that firms and traders have some sway over prices and wages. When I worked at the U.S. Treasury Department in 2009, some of the best financial economists in the world thought it inconceivable that foreign exchange markets, that's the LaBerre system, could be manipulated. After all, these are the largest and non-liquid markets in the world. Only later we learned that several traders had been convicted of collusion on the rate exchange. LaBerre was totally rigged. One economist thought that the labor markets are imperfect and subject to manipulation. However, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations there, a classic book, he wrote that employers are always and anywhere in a sort of tacit but constraint and uniform combination not to raise wages of labor above their actual rate. To violate the combination is anywhere most unpopular action and sort of a reproach to a master amongst his neighbors and equals. He ridiculed naysayers who doubted that the employer collusion as ignorant of the world as a subject. In full conspiracy models, he added that we seldom indeed hear of this combination because it's unusual and one may save the natural state of things which nobody ever heard of. Broadly speaking, there are two variables of economic models that give employers some discretion over wage setting. The first, pioneered by Joan Robinson, a static monopoly model which where a single employer faces the upward slope labor market curve. This can easily be extended to oligarchic, where a small number of employers that dominate a market and face the upper slope labor curve, or to a Smith-like situation where employers collude to suppress wages below competitive rates. Secondly, the second-class model pioneered by Ken Burdell and Morrison and I'm going to try to pronounce his name, and Peter Diamond, and extended by Alan Manning. It's in 2003. It takes time and effect for workers to search for openings, for firms to search for workers. As a consequence, if a firm pays a little less than the going rate, it would not lose all the workers or find it impossible to hire new ones. Very important point. In fact, there is no single ongoing wage in these models, but a range of plausible effects that firms could make, or a bargain that firms and workers could strike. And we see this now in terms of bonuses being offered, and as a practical matter, both models are equivalent to assuming that the labor market curve to a firm is upward sloping and instead of indefinitely elastic. Firms operate with costly vacancies in their model, yet resist raising wages because pay would need to be increased for all workers, not just the incremental workers hired. And that has been a case. If the employer colludes to hold wages to a fixed below market rate, or if a monopoly power increases over time, then these wages will remain stubbornly resistant to upward pressure and that is basically what is happening here. High pressure labor markets tend to boost wages and opportunities for low wage workers. This was conceivably demonstrated by Arthur Occam in a Brookings paper in 1973, and confirmed by experiments and subsequent recoveries, including the current one in his Brookings paper here, follow-up to Arthur Occam by Larry Ketz. And I similarly found that the wedge Phillips curve relation is steeper at a lower decimals. In other words, wage growth is more responsive to unemployment for less skilled workers and lower paid workers. This has been a part of the focus of the DJ Trump economic plan. Basically jobs, factory-type jobs, manufacturing jobs. And in 2018, many of those jobs are at, we'll say, about $18 to $20 an hour or less. The wage Phillips curve moves over time. A worker paid the minimum wage, and the unemployed rate threshold requires to generate positive wage growth for the medium worker, which is in a fluctuational. For an unemployment rate associated with zero, expect real compensation growth falls to fell to 6.8% in the 70s to a 5.4% in the 90s. It appears to have fallen even further in the 2000s. We won't go into all of this, but we'll move along here. The average wage growth is weaker than one would expect from conventional relations. And then again, back to the Phillips wage curve. I have been estimating for years, which predicts wage growth of less than -1. Inflation function is the unemployment rate, annual rate growth of 1 to 1.5%. Slower productivity growth could explain as much as an additional percentage point in the puzzle. There is growing evidence supporting the central role of monopoly power in the job market, stemming from both the employer's concentration and dynamic wage considerations. That was from Berman and Kim. As 3 in his listing here. Full monopoly powers have probably always existed in labor markets, but the forces that traditionally counterbalance monopoly powers and boost wages bargaining power have been eroded. And this is union membership. We'll put this falling from a quarter of the workforce in 1980 to 10% in 10.7 to be precise in 2017. And let me just fly down this. Another indicator of an aggressive labor supply is fairly elastic. Considered from 2014-2018, the real medium weekly earnings of full-time workers increased at 5.4%, and the economy moved to full employment. Yet the civilian workforce participation rate was unchanged at 62.9 in 2014 and 62.8 in 2018. To be clear, I'm not arguing that aggregate labor supply is perfectly inelastic. There's some response to wage and working conditions. On balance, however, I argue that the main effect of the increase in monopoly power and decline in workers' bargaining power over the last few decades have shrunk the size of the pie. And lastly, I turn to a different part of my lecture, what this means for monetary policy. And it goes without saying that the best tool to address anti-competitive practices in the marketplace is antitrust enforcement. And towards that end, the Obama administration, Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission issued new guidelines. Well, we're not going to see it now. And let me finish up the good professor's paper here. And whoops. To conclude, I think it's important for the central bank to become aware of the impact of growing use of monopoly power and non-competitive labor market practices on wages, employment, and output. What this means for monetary policy, however, is less clear. My tentative advice is that the optimal central bank response depends on the extent to which workers' wage growth is passed through to price and allocation of profits, and the elasticity of aggregate labor supply, and the ability of a booming economy to counteract collusive behavior in anti-competition labor markets. These considerations should be part of the conversation at the central bank. And this is a very interesting paper. Spent a little time on it because this shows us this is Dr. Alan Kruger. And this is Alberto Cavallo. He's at the Harvard Business School. The Amazon Effect. I studied how online competition with its shrinking margins, algorithmic pricing technologies, and the transparency of the web can change the pricing behavior of large retailers in the U.S. and affect aggregate inflation dynamics. In particular, I show that in the past 10 years, online competition has raised both for the frequency of price changes and degree of uniform pricing across locations. And we've seen that on Amazon and various other retailers. At one time, the consumer, we close our broadcast, keep their eyes on the consumer, keep their eyes on the price. There were low prices and sometimes a variation, and we see occasionally is maybe 10% between retailers there, but we don't see as much now. So this bears out Professor Cavallo's paper. And let's just get to it here. Delivered this on the 10th. Introduction: online retailers such as Amazon, growing force in consumer retail markets. The share of sales continues to grow, particularly in the U.S., prompting economists to wonder about their impact on inflation. Much of the attention amongst central bankers and the press has been on whether the competition between online and traditional retailers is reducing retail markup and putting downward pressure on prices. The Amazon effect could help explain the relatively low level of inflation experienced in the U.S. in recent years. Furthermore, while the potentially sizable and is limited to how much markup can fall, and that is very important here. The Amazon effect disappears when that limit is reached. Are there long-lasting effects on online competition on inflation dynamics? In this paper, I will focus on the way the online competition is affecting price behavior, such as the frequency of price changes, and that is done by the algorithm itself, or the degree of price suspension across locations. Changes in the way these prices decisions are made can make much more of a persistent effect on inflation dynamics than one-time reduction in the marketplace. In particular, I focus on two prices between behaviors that tend to characterize Amazon: a high degree of price flexibility and the prevalence of uniform pricing across locations. When combined, these factors can increase the sensitivity of prices to a nationwide aggregate shock, such as changes in average gas prices, the nominal exchange rate, or import tariffs. To document these new trends in retail prices behavior, I use several macro price databases available at the B and Price project at Harvard and MIT. An advantage of this data is that they are collected in large brick-and-mortar retailers that also sell online. So in other words, you're seeing more of a combination of things happening here. I show that the frequency of price changes in multiple channel retailers have increased for the last 10 years. Implied duration for regular prices changed. This is which excluded sales and temporary discounts, have fallen from 6 months in 2008-2010. Now that was during the Depression, to approximately 3.65 in 14, and the level here has obviously changed. I use regression of individual products sold on the Walmart website from 2016 to 2014 shows that these goods that can be easily found on Amazon tend to impact the duration that are 20% shorter than the rest. And it's still the old loss leader that comes in here. I focus on prices back to Cordova here. Identical goods across locations. Nearly all retailers that sell online tend to have a single price, a uniform pricing strategy regardless of the location of buyer. Uniform pricing has been documented before separately from online, offline retailers, and there have been some of this. But the problem is, in this study here, Vega and Jinsnow, this is in 2017. I go a step forward and make a direct comparison by collecting prices in multiple zip codes for Amazon and 3 traditional retailers: Walmart, Safeway, and Best Buy. And one thing to note here, being in the computer game, that many of the items you see, computer products, not as much now, notebooks and smartphones, they run as loss leaders. The pricing is sort of all over the place in some of these items. You get into big screen, say TVs, and if you start looking at standard prices, they'll be in the 400s, and if you go to various retailers, about the same. The pricing is sort of uniformed in these items. It used to not be. We use Walmart's micro data from 2016 to 18 to find that online competition increased. The short-run pass-through into prices coming from gasoline exchange rates fluctuations, using the longer time a series of sector price indicators and match product cross-country data sets. I've further solved that the degree of sensitivity of prices to exchange rates have been increasing over time. It's approaching a level of previously only seen for tractable imports at the dock. Overall, these results suggest that retail prices are less insulated from this type of arrogant shock. My paper builds on a growing literature that studies how the internet is affecting price and inflation. And go back to a number of people here. I build on these findings to show how online competition is affecting traditional multi-channel retailers and their pricing across locations. One of the things happening here is these algorithms are available now to many and not a few. So the Amazon effect can be there. The paper also contributes to the uniform pricing literature highlighted by the connection between online and offline markets. And this is Stetson and Company in 2008. Well, things have moved on since that. The data, I use several databases. It's very important here. The BPP, in all cases, macro data were collected using a web scraping. That just means you're downloading method for websites of large multi-channel retailers. We all use that, and that's by using R and other products. Let's see. To measure price behavior, here we use a database constructed by Price Stats. That's a private firm. Price Stats collects daily prices from products sold by multi-channel retailers, 2008 to 2017. Each product is classified with UN classification of individual consumption according to a purpose. And you won't get into that, but to measure pass-through into relative prices across countries. Anyway, we finally get to the Samsung 6165 TV. Let's see, per unit pricing. Well, anyway, goods are the first calculated and the average within a country. The product level, these databases previously used and described anyway. So many of these databases are available to everyone. Walmart has 50,000 products sold during March of 2018. For each good, I've created a dummy variable that identifies whether the product can be easily found on the website. This variable is used as a proxy for online competition in several sections. Price fluctuation. Online retailers tend to change prices more frequently than brick and mortar, and no doubt about that one. The high frequency of online price changes may be caused in part by the use of automated algorithms to make the decisions. No doubt about that. And let me move on through this paper here. Very long paper. It's 42 pages long, and obviously some things we're not going to be able to do. And let's just move down here. Behavior of regular prices in large retailers. The frequency of price changes 2008 to 2010, 15.43, 2011, 22.39, and 2014 to 17, 27.39. So, in other words, more changing here. The size of price increases. They actually lowered 15.42 in 2008. During the Depression, they were 18 point something there. Now, we haven't seen the tariff effects there. That'll be something for a future show. Figure out which way we're going after I read this whole study. But let me get down and conclude this. Conclusion. Online competition can affect retail pricing in many ways. An important and often overlooked mechanism is the way it changes retail pricing behavior, which can be long-lasting effect on inflation dynamics. In this paper, studies pricing behavior for large multi-channel retailers in the U.S. in the past 10 years, a decade, shows that online competition increased both the frequency of price changes and the degree of uniform prices across locations. In other words, you get the same price in Maine as in California if you're online. For monetary policy and those interested in inflation dynamics, the implication is that retail pricing are becoming less isolated from these common nationwide shocks. Fuel prices, exchange rates, fluctuation, or other forces affecting costs that may enter the pricing algorithms used by these firms. And this is one thing at Cranston Analytics we've been looking at for a very, very long time, delving from macro to microeconomics and looking at things like the market and various other things that normally are not putting it into our model. So anyway, we'll leave Mr. Cadavalo there. We got Mr. Kruger. Anyway, Dr. Alberto Cavallo. Anyway, we finished him off. And let me do the numbers here. I don't know where we are in terms of time. Yeah, we're in pretty good shape, actually. Just make sure that I got everyone I need to get. We'll do the markets now. Actually, this is much shorter than I thought, but we'll pinch. Oh, we got to get this one in here. The Korishnikov CV1. This is from the BBC. Is the Russian Federation's answer to Tesla. The firm that's behind the AK-47, the CV1. The CB1, inspired by the Soviet hatchback, created in 1970s, was a revolutionary cutting-edge supercar. Nonetheless, it added that in full development, the car would top speeds several times higher than current electric vehicles produced by its firm and would be able to travel 220 miles, that is 350 kilometers, on a single charge. Kalishnikov has been looking to take its brand in different directions, recently launching a clothing line, categories of personal items ranging from umbrellas to smartphone covers. They're in just about everything. They also have a robot named, I think it's Otto. Anyway, Kalishnikov, Igor, so Igor, a.k.a. Little Igor. It's 4 meters, that is 3 feet tall, and designed for carrying out engineering and combat type of situation. Well, this car is one of the more interesting things here. Let me get to the markets, where we're coming from. This is Bloomberg. There we go. Figure out where we're starting here. We'll start in the Asia sector. The Nikkei was, let me see where the Nikkei... 0.49, that is down. That's the 1 month average. The for the Nikkei, the topic 3.75. The Hang Seng at 0.34, and these are all in negative, incidentally. And the CSI index negative 5.56 in the Asian market. In a euro, the euro stoxy at, for 1 month, negative 2.83. The FTSE 100, negative 1.5%. The DAC at, again, a negative 3.62. The calc at a negative 1.44. And in Spain, at negative 2.82. The Dow, where is it? At a, wait a minute here. And 1 month at 1.38, it looks like. Why don't they put it in blue? Anyway, the NASDAQ composite, all these are positive at 2.7 here from Bloomberg. And let me see, commodities overview here. The Bloomberg Commodity Index at 172.83, that is his value. The UBS Bloomberg Index at 927.70. The Reuters at 197.43. And the Reuters International, let's see what it is. At 0.70% there. Energy, Brent crude at $75.82. West Texas Intermediate at $60.72. T-Boone Pickens is still jumping for joy in his retirement. The gasoline index, about the same, actually, at 207.78. Natural gas down 0.05. Home heating oil, well, it's about the same at 2.53. That is from Bloomberg, and let me just, this is all the Bloomberg stuff, get back to the BBC. I just want to make certain that we get everything right here. And let me see, market data. Let me just make sure here. The FTSE was at 0.19. That's the FTSE 100. Put FTSE 250 at 0.13. All these are in the positive, and it would go to Amsterdam, 0.25. A little bit better coverage here. The calc at 0.24% there. The DAC at 0.23%, all in the positive. The European Stoxy at 2.7%. In Spain, this is Madrid, at 2.3% there. So they do a little better job of covering the markets. Let me see, oh, okay. In Asia, we have in Bombay, negative 22% there, and Hang Seng in Hong Kong at negative 4.3, and the Nikkei at 0.85. We're doing a little bit better here, and the Dow at 0.25, NASDAQ at 0.86, in the positive, and the S&P 500. We're going to have to go to a better method here because we don't have the Merck anyway at 2.6 in Chicago. And the currencies, euro is unchanged at 1.10055. And the euro, unchanged there, U.S. And various other people. Commodities, Brent crude futures were up $1 up 1.46. $75.82. Same thing we gave you there. West Texas crude at $68.72. We didn't get gold, and we will get gold on the Forex, up 22 cents at $1,189.95. And natural gas was down at 1.59 according to the BBC. And that is that there. We're getting less market data. We'll go to a third source. Next week we'll start to pan this out a little bit better. But a summary basically here, if we look at the two papers, Dr. Cavallo paper on the Amazon effect, basically they're using the modern method of doing it is to scrape. What that means is going to the Amazon site and using a program like R, and scraping the prices and using a model to come out where those prices are when you have 50,000 prices. You could also go to eBay. You could go to Walmart, which has online pricing. Sometimes is more favorable to the consumer than in-store pricing, in-store specials. You could do a lot of different things. The Best Buys of the world. And various other major retailers. Micro Center, we use them quite a bit. And let's see, who else do we have? The Fry. That is for TVs, computer parts, etc. Many of these retailers sell a combination of things. And, of course, the Bass eBay marketplace, they have all kinds of retailers selling all sorts of things. You can order, you name it. Like we know from China, various. In fact, there's discussion about postal rates. You can in times order things directly from China, and it's delivered via the U.S. Post or Postal Service, cheaper than you can order it here in the U.S. or from other countries. And more this is happening. This is why you have more global purchasing now. If it's particularly on eBay, you go there. Companies all over the world, you can find these products, and they are sent directly to you many times. And these are usually small items. The same thing with Amazon Prime, these small items that are $5 or so. And Amazon now even has a return policy. You have up to 30 days to get it back if you don't want it. An associate that continually orders things and returns things, including clothing. You can order clothing, shoes, etc., try them on, just like going to basically a brick-and-mortar store. But what we want to look at is it affect the pricing. In other words, if a pair of shoes cost $80 on Amazon, what would be New Balance, or who I don't want to name New Balance, but whomever, Nike, you name it, is that standard on other sites? And then you have the overstock sites that will have, say, a model that has just went out, or whatever the story is. So in other words, you have all types of pricing out there, and this pricing, there's a correlation between it and, say, the price of petrol, gasoline. Why? Because in the U.S., 70-80% of consumer spending, the economy is based on consumer spending. Thus, if consumers allocate too much of their disposable income, say, to gasoline, thus the whole situation involving Saudi Arabia and the Trump administrations to keep gas prices artificially low. But, however, it depends obviously on many things, such as rents. Rents are a very important situation. In any good model, that has to be factored in. And in many areas, this was the case in Ames, Iowa. They had increased this woman's rent, I think the past 2 years or so, by about $70. And she worked at the Iowa State University. But in the summer, she worked at some restaurant and made less money there. But also at the same time, because of political actions of the Iowa legislature and the Iowa government, a Republican operation, they cut the bargaining power of unions. Thus, they at one time got, we'll say, 3.5 to even 7% annual raises. Now they're getting just 1%. So this is how it impacts what workers are able to do. I just noticed here someplace that DJ Trump's attempt to change federal work rules has met a roadblock by the courts. Well, what this means is federal workers would have less bargaining power. Now their unions have been kicked out of federal office buildings, and the ability to represent the workers have been impacted. And in many states, the ability, Illinois, for example, and the recent Supreme Court decision, the ability of unions to collect dues from all workers, because there can be, say, a union of 100 people or 1,000 people. 10% of those people disagree and don't want their money put into the union's coffers. So an example is what happened in Wisconsin under Walker, when he signed his the legislation by the Republican legislature to decertify collective bargaining basically in Wisconsin as far as the unions were concerned, and union dues. Therefore, state workers receive less in terms of not only pay but benefits. That is what Dr. Kruger is talking about from Princeton, this whole impact. And this is the reason we see stagnant wages there across industries. And you particularly see this in information technology. Once the rate is set, that's pretty much the rate at most concerns, although there's scarcity at many of these firms in occupations. Now, in the manufacturing sector and, say, transportation, etc., where there is scarcity there, they have numerous openings for workers, and they are not filled. Now, some of the smaller firms just simply don't fill some of these jobs that are quote-unquote low-paying jobs. But that is the problem. When the amounts of rents and amounts of petrol go up, the worker has less discretionary income to go and spend at Amazon. And then that affects all of these industries. The cable industry has been affected right and left. And many things have changed. So to sum all this up, all of the models, including the Fed models, are going to do more what we call scraping in the days and weeks ahead. The Fed will raise the interest rate 25 basis points, because what is happening here, inflation, we saw inflation in the 70s creep up, but we also saw things happen in 2008, not necessarily inflation, but the bubble burst and the depression was upon us, and the Fed did not have data to react to that. We also saw in the recent Turkey, their dollar going down, but a small economy didn't impact enough people. But a globalized economy, one particular nation, particularly if it's a larger economy than Turkey, and we look to the UK and their basic situation there as to how it will affect their economy. We see some effects happening. During the week at Wells Fargo, the mortgage unit laid off 635 workers across many states. The mortgage activity is not what it used to be, and obviously as the interest rate ticks up, and it's all at an all-time low. So if you're not getting activity at an all-time low, as it ticks up, we'll say a 4 percentage point, around 2.5, 3%, 3.5% at the low elm. So mortgage rates will go up, credit card rates will go up, and we also see credit card defaults, and how the automobile market will go, how the housing market, in terms of course, labor shortage, they have sort of knocked it down. So a lot of information you see day to day about a supercharged economy. That is not yet, if you, the old expression, look under the hood, there are things that are starting to point, particularly the the tariffs, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, aluminium, and various other things there in these trade situations the relationship with Canada, the relationship with Mexico, but also the psychological fallout. Now, present day, the market has been talked up. But that's only tentatively. You see Amazon being a $1 billion company. It doesn't really matter. That's on paper. Google will approach that also. But Google is in the ad business. Amazon is in the retail business. And as the consumer discretionary dollar shrinks, Amazon will start hurting. Walmart is the same thing. Walmart, you recall, in the past depression and after the past depression, they were pretty stagnant. Also, the Target Corporation, they reported better than expected earnings. But you have to look inside, and we'll look more at this in coming broadcasts. Nonetheless, this will conclude what we're doing here. We will attach these studies, and for those in business, make it a productive one. And the consumer, obviously, you've been keeping your eye on the prize. I believe we have one more. We don't broadcast for the month of. Let me just look at this real quickly here. And no, we don't. We'll be the month of September when we return to you. Good day. From us, our long-running sponsor, Cranston Analytics, and WBRN Radio, which we're powering across and beaming to you on the Numbers Man channel and at Bostonred.org, where we are all there. And have a good week.